Alright everyone, so in this video here, I wanted to do something different and basically talk about some gaming memories. Now, this is actually going to be a first of several series of videos. This is just going to be me talking about a particular franchise in whole that I've always enjoyed when I was a kid. And this is one of them. This is kind of high up there in terms of arcade racers for me. The Rush series. So the San Francisco Rush, well, when I say San Francisco Rush, is pretty much all of them except for Rush 2. I'll get to that in a minute. But, and just to let you know, I am aware that there are versions of Rush 2049 in those compilations, and they got those, there's also like the Alcatraz version that came out on one of the compilations. And there was a later release on newer consoles called Rush. But that was more of a completely different game than what this was. And in some ways, it was a little disappointing. And honestly, if it really wasn't for the name, I probably would have never touched it. But the Rush series, the original series of games that came out on home consoles. So we obviously got San Francisco Rush Extreme Racing. I have both the N64 and the PlayStation. I don't think a lot of people knew about this. There was a PlayStation version, and it was terrible, which probably explains why there was never another edition of the Rush game to come out on the original PlayStation. Because because it didn't come out well, and the sales figures probably sucked. This one actually sold pretty well, and obviously it continued. So, when it comes to the original San Francisco Rush, there are good and bad things about both of these versions. I'm going to start out with the PlayStation version because there's really not much to really talk about, only because the PlayStation version, even though it was a different developer that basically recreated the game for the PlayStation, the gameplay, honestly, is where it really fell. The cars did not handle that well. Actually, the cars handled terribly. It didn't have the big jumps and all that. You know, I don't know if it's just the engine they use or if it's more of a limitation when it comes to the PlayStation. But the PlayStation version never really had those big jumps like the N64 version did. So, while I did play a little bit of the PlayStation version, I quickly realized, like, man, this version's so bad. And it's unfortunate, too, because some of the good things about it, for a PlayStation game, it didn't look, at least to me, the game didn't look too bad. And the developers actually did a pretty decent job of mimicking the arcade experience with the user interface and the way you navigate through the menu, selecting the cars, the tracks, and all that stuff. It's basically taken the arcade version, dumbing it down for the PlayStation, but essentially screwing up the gameplay side of it. That's really the biggest problem with the PlayStation version. Now, if we jump over to the N64 version, it's kind of the complete opposite. They didn't really bother to mimic the interface when it comes to the arcade version. They basically redesigned the interface for home use, but not only that, the N64 version had more tracks also. So for basically, I don't remember what the prices for PlayStation games were typically back in the day. But let's just say if they were roughly about the same price, maybe the N64 version was a little bit more money. But you are getting quite a bit of more content on the N64 version, plus the gameplay is much better. Now, is it as good as the newer versions of the game? No, but for a first attempt, it was actually really good. Though there was an issue when it comes to the driving mechanics that they actually solved going to Rush 2049, was that if you're doing high jumps and all that and you're trying to steer, your vehicle kind of tends to get stuck on the street. It will go forward, but it won't really turn, because I think it had to do some kind of collision detection thing that was like in the engine or something like that. But apart from that, this game was still a lot of fun. Now, obviously because the N64 version sold decent enough, Midway decided to release a sequel. Now, Rush 2 Extreme Racing USA, this was an end. And what's odd about this is that they never used the only for Nintendo 64 logo. And I looked it up. I was doing my research. There was never an arcade version. There was never any other console that had Rush 2 released anywhere else. So this was essentially an N64 exclusive, but they never emphasized that. The only one that they ever emphasized, only for, was obviously the Game Boy Color version, but I'll get to that. But Rush 2 went in a slightly different direction. It's not that it's a bad game. It's actually a good game too. The problem is that it kind of took away the extreme racing part of it, with the high jumps and all that stuff. Basically, it's taking the Rush games and basically making it more grounded. That's really the best way to put it. Yeah, there are some slight jumps and all that, but it's really not that much. It's really just driving around the tracks, but there's really not much high octane driving going on. It's still a good game, but in terms of the other versions, it was a slight letdown. Now, there are some good things about this, and one of the big ones actually was Stunt Mode. Stunt Mode actually debuted in Rush 2. Now, obviously when Rush 2049 came out, they basically took the Stunt Mode and amplified it, but that was actually one of the highlights of Rush 2 at the time. And there were actually some really decent tracks. One of my favorite ones actually in Rush 2 is there's a track that they basically recreated the Midway development office in the game. So basically, think of it like Micro Machines, but in the Rush game for that track, which is actually kind of cool. Completely different direction with that track, but nonetheless, it's still a fun game. I still recommend this game, but if you're looking to pick one game out of this group, it has to be San Francisco Rush 2049. The reason why I say this, and I'll get into the details between the differences between the N64 and Dreamcast, but the reason why I say that is because this is where they pretty much perfected the gameplay part of it. The environments is really, really cool. It goes in a more futuristic San Francisco, hence 2049. But also, it's fun. That's really the big thing. And plus, on top of that, they actually added a lot more content into the home console version. And there's just so much you can do with it in terms of value in hours of play in this version, that it pretty much makes the previous versions in some ways obsolete, because I've sunk hours and hours and hours into 2049. Now, before I talk about the differences between the N64 and Dreamcast, let's talk about the Game Boy Color version. There was a version on the Game Boy Color, and while they did try to mimic within the hardware limitations of the Game Boy Color, truthfully, it's really just a top-down racing game, but it's not like the single screen version. You know, it's the kind that, you know, is top-down and the camera's following the car, but from a top-down view. And honestly, while they do use some of the sound effects and stuff like that, you know, from the console version, let's just say it's not a terrible game, but truthfully, this was really a pointless version to be bothered with. But nonetheless, I have it just to complete the collection for it. But now, let's talk about the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Dreamcast version. And the reason why I say this is because this is one of the few times where if you have a Dreamcast or an N64 and you're picking between the two, this is one of the very few cases where I can actually tell you can't go wrong with either version. I know that's a big shocker there, because when you compare the Nintendo 64 hardware-wise to the Sega Dreamcast, hardware-wise, the Dreamcast is going to be much, much better in all fronts. Not necessarily in this case. Now, graphically and resolution-wise, yes, the Dreamcast version is better in that way. But in terms of the gameplay, in terms of the sound, the content of the game, they're both equal in that way. So you still have the same amount of tracks, you still have all the collectibles and all that stuff. You can still sink hours and hours and hours into both versions. The biggest difference, apart from the graphics, and I will say this, the N64 version, even with the expansion pack, for an N64 game, this is actually one of the better looking games for the N64. If you want a game for the N64 that basically showcases graphically what the Nintendo 64 can do, this is probably in the top 5 of all the games that came out. I'm actually dead serious about that. And the reason why I say that too is, while there are some N64 games that do look cleaner graphically, you know, slightly higher resolution, the problem with that is you're sacrificing the frame rate. This is one of the few cases where the game looks good enough, but it still has a steady frame rate to it. And when you are comparing between both versions, I mean, when I say they are pretty much feature-rich parity, I actually mean that. Because you're getting all the tracks, you're getting the stunt mode, you're getting all the stunt tracks. Both versions you can do up to 4 players at once. I mean, the only real difference, really, is the music. The music are actually different from both versions. And this is where I say it doesn't really matter which version, because the soundtrack on both versions are really, really good. Now, the sound out of the Dreamcast version is going to sound cleaner than the N64. Let's just be real about that. You know, you're talking about a cartridge versus, you know, a disc, and you're just going to get better audio just because there's a lot more storage to be used on the Dreamcast, just because of the media itself. But nonetheless, what they did here in the N64 version is really, really impressive. Now, when it comes to all these games, which one, though, would I recommend someone jump into? And that even comes down to which console. So, I'll just be straight up. 2049 is really the version that you should pretty much jump into. While these other versions, while the two previous N64 versions are good, 2049 is pretty much near perfection in terms of arcade racing. Now, when it comes to the N64 and Dreamcast version, it's really, really close. Here's what I think. The sound, I personally prefer the soundtrack out of the N64 version, but everything else on the Dreamcast version. So, while the soundtrack in the Dreamcast version is really good, the music they use for the N64 version seems to fit better with the franchise than it did on the CD-based console. So all in all, I would say, in terms of order of best to worst, well, I'll put the PlayStation version as the worst, then 2049 on the Game Boy Color. I would probably put Rush 2, San Francisco Rush. I have to do the N64, then the Dreamcast, in terms of worst to best. While I do like the music in the N64 version, and the gameplay is pretty much identical, the Dreamcast truthfully does get the slight edge, only for the graphic side of things. So, yeah, that's the order. So, if you're out there looking for any of these versions, this is the order I would say. So yeah, that's my pick for this, and that's the order I'm doing it. So if I actually, put this in frame, close enough, there it is. So, but here's the thing though. If I'm rating these games, say out of 5 or 10 or 100, whatever the maximum arbitrary score is, let's just do out of 5. I would give the Dreamcast version of 2049 pretty much a 5 out of 5. The N64, 4.5. Rush 2049, I give it a solid 4, and then Rush 2, I would actually give it a 3. Even though there are some good aspects of it, I don't know if I stated this too much about Rush 2. I do like it, but it's not really an exciting version of the series. I think that's the best way to put it. It feels a little too generic with the racing part of it. I'll be honest with you, some of the races in this version feels a little too long, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, still good. So I still give this a 3 out of 5. I give this one a 2 out of 5, in the PlayStation version a 1 out of 5, only because the gameplay part of it is that bad in this version. And I'm going to say this, it's actually unfortunate because, well, I'm not really a fanboy or anything when it comes to the different platforms. I get the platforms I want to play on, the games I'm interested in, and that's how it is. So, anyway, I'll end it here. It's getting a little too long, and there it is. So that's it. Like always, have a good one. Leave those comments down below. Make sure you like this video, share this video, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and like always, have a good one.